You have stumbled upon or perhaps intentionally ended up here at my podcast, Actual Leigh. No matter the path that led you here, I hope that you will hang out and join me for a truly enjoyable conversation. Let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome to Actual Leigh. I almost forgot the name of my podcast. Hanging out with Sarah today, who we've actually never talked before, but we have been interacting online for at least 5 years now, but probably longer at this point.
It's probably been closer to 10 because I remember
Yeah,
you're a kitten cam friend, and John started the podcast when I was in grad school, and it's been 11 years since I was in grad school. So
yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, I
time
guess because it
flies.
was right after my health issue started, and B invited me into the group. So yeah. And that was that. And honestly, being pulled into that group, which is no more now because of things, because humans do things, drama things, was like so like life changing for me, like especially at the
Hmm.
time, and then like the friends and all the support that I've gotten over the years, and it's all like the foundation of it is that we all like cats and swear words, really like.
I think that about encapsulates it. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's cool. There's so many good personalities that, are in my life now because of that. So, thank you for offering to be on the podcast and stuff. And um
Absolutely.
yeah, you mentioned something about old buildings or something. So like, you know, I was like, ooh, info dump. I like info dumps. So
Yeah,
what
I
it
can't remember what I mentioned. I probably mentioned book collecting. I probably mentioned old buildings.
yeah. What did you go to grad school for?
I got my master's in library and science degree. I'm not currently working as a librarian, but I am doing research in my spare time. And I still think of myself as a librarian because, like, let's be real, like, it's all about nerding out over information and who has access to that information and how that information is stored long term and short term, and how to organize that information so people can find it. And I feel like you would appreciate that. It's all about making information accessible. And like what I used to do, actually around the time that I was watching the kitten cam, I was a rare book cataloger, and that was all about so when you go to a public library catalog, or any institutional library catalog, I guess, whether it's university or public, or as long as it's not a private collection, that entry that you see for a book, there's metadata behind it. So there's behind the scenes data, and that's all about creating especially if it's a rare book, creating a copy specific description so people know why that copy in particular is unique. And also figuring out like the subject headings to use. And what those are is, if somebody was looking for this book, what would they type into a search engine? And there's a lot of interesting information about the biases of subject heading. Like, there's doctors and female doctors, and why aren't women doctors just classified as doctors? Biases like that. And until recently, actually like a decade ago, instead of cooking, cookbooks were filed under cookery, you know
Yeah.
so anyway, I don't know how we got on that sideline, but I'm
I
interested in.
Yeah, there's like the whole thing of like the sexy librarian thing, and then I've always thought the reason why librarians are hot is because they're really fucking smart. Like,
Yeah,
you know, it's
it's literally just nerddom.
I was so bummed out when I found out you had to like get like degrees and stuff to be a librarian because as a kid, I spent a lot of time. I used to cut school to go to the library. I loved the library. The librarian knew that things were kind of rough for me, so like she wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
report me for truancy and just let me hang out and
Aw.
read the books. And I mean, I read so much as a kid, and I was like, oh, it'd be so cool to be a librarian, but I couldn't like. I was never able to figure out like the college thing. So that to me was like, oh, I can't do that because it requires,
Aw.
you know, but but also like I had no idea, so I was very impressed when I found out that it required so much education to be able to do that.
Yeah,
And
although
that
I will let you in on a secret, which may not be the experience for others, but my bachelor's degree was so hard, and it's especially hard because I have a generalized anxiety disorder, and I didn't figure out until I was like maybe more than halfway through my bachelor's degree that I had anxiety. Like, oh, this shit that I've been feeling since for as long as I can remember has a name. It's not just me being,
yeah,
neurotic or a hypochondriac. But anyway, where was I going with that? Oh, bachelor's degree. So hard because of mental health struggles and anxiety. And I made myself sick my first semester at real college because, I thought this is costing my parents so much money and we had to take out loans and like, I've got to get straight A's.
yeah,
And like, I was literally making my body sick. Yeah, anyway, but compared to the like 8.5 years it took me to struggle through my bachelor's degree, master's degree, so easy. It was so easy. But I also did not have to, for your library degree, you don't have, at least for the program I was in, you don't have to write a thesis. It's just coursework. And apart from a couple core credits, it's just like, what would you like to do in librarianship? Pick,
yeah,
so I took a bunch of archives and special collections and genealogy and nerdy stuff that I liked, whereas some
yeah,
people think like I would like to be a law librarian or I would like to be a children's librarian. You cannot pay me enough to be a public school or a children's or a public librarian, which is more like social worker and school librarian. Could not pay me enough
yeah.
to do it. But point is you can kind of pick your own track. And it was, at least for me, it was an easy program after just, yeah, bachelor's
That's
degree. It's
interesting.
rough.
Do you think that the master's section of it was a little bit easier also because you were managing the mental health part of it more as well? Or
Um, that's a good question. I did go back on medication around the time I started library school, and that helped tremendously. Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
I didn't even think about that, but you're probably right. That was probably a big part of why it was a little breezier.
Yeah. I have this question. I don't know if you know the answer, maybe you do, but the way that the books were cataloged before we had like digital databases, I'm assuming that there was sort of like a central repository or whatever for all
Hmm.
of the different books. And I don't, did every library like have like a printout or how did they access to know?
Um, Probably has had to do with the Library of Congress, which is still sort of in the United States, the central repository for all information and stuff. There's a cataloging system that supplanted the Dewey Decimal System, which I grew up with, which is called the Library of Congress. Um, the Library of Congress classification system, their Library of Congress subject headings and stuff. But I like with Dewey Decimal, it just had a certain logic. So I think if you were a cataloger, like let's say you had a children's book about farm animals, and maybe it was specifically about pigs, you would know that, like children's books would be under this number, and this particular string of numbers represented pigs, but that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I know that it all happened on card catalogs. People catalog stuff by hand, but I think the
Yeah.
Library of Congress would perhaps assign Dewey Decimal numbers. I could be totally wrong though. I want to say like on the copyright pages of vintage books, there might be Dewey Decimal numbers, but I could just be totally pulling that out of my ass.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. I was like, I can't remember like if the books had the information in it. So I was wondering, like if they're, because I would imagine a lot of books would just they'd all have the same info, but then if there was like a that there just might be
Mhm.
a little bit of chaos, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think
And
if you had the same book and if you went to two different libraries back in the day, they would have the same Dewey Decimal number. I'm 99% sure, but it has been long since I have done my master's degree and I'm out of, whoa, I'm Xing out of the Zoom window. I'm out of practice. So,
yeah, that's one of the areas where because there's a lot of things that technology hasn't necessarily made better for us, but I feel like just keeping track of like books and information. That way, that's where computers and stuff really,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where like people don't even realize how powerful that is and how much that's like helped and just sort of changed the landscape,
Mm-hmm.
for people. But
Yeah, I know that when I would pick out a book, like very seldom would I have to come up with and I'm trying to think, I don't think I ever had to, like, because most books out there, there's another copy. And if there's another copy, somebody's put it into a library system. And so a lot of what I would do was called, and again, I'm pulling back 10 years. I feel like I'm so out of the loop. It was called there's copy cataloging where if you, Leigh, started your own library and you had a bunch of John Grisham books, like if you had access to the library cataloging software, you would just type that John Grisham title and it would poop out like pre-made record and you would just copy it because there's nothing copy specific about that information unless, maybe John Grisham signed it and said, I love you so much.
yeah.
I want to be on your podcast again. I don't know. You would make a copy specific record. But I did what was more enhanced cataloging where I would find a pretty good record of something and then I would just copy that over to our system. And it would already have things like Library of Congress, subject heading, Dewey Decimal Number, subject headings assigned. Sometimes I would have to enhance it, which means like adding more information, making it better. Um, but I did do some original cataloging, which is just you make it up from scratch. And that's kind of interesting. But
Yeah.
actually, that kind of gives us a good segue into the project I'm working on with the book collector. So it used to be, you were talking about how people take library technology for granted and all the cool things that it's enabled. Well, one of the things is it used to be whether you had a book that was just what we in the trade call the reading copy, which means like there's no resale value. You just keep it around because you want it to read. That's what most of the books in my collection are. Like I just keep them around because eventually I want to read them. Um, but whether you had just a standard lending copy for a public library or a rare book, you had the same 3x5, excuse me, card catalog to be able to put a bunch of information on it. And you can see with where a rare book, where the interest is often not always in the text, but who might have owned that book previously. Is it a special binding? Like, is it a binding that has jewels in it? Because there are such things. Um, does it have a particular inscription from somebody who was hanged at the Tower of London? Something cool like that. um, there's only so much you can fit on that card. And so back in the day when rare book cataloging was being done, if somebody owned a book and they were, and again, like as with all information, it's always filtered through the bias of the person who's, you know, taking the head on it. Losing train of thought. Oh, so if that person, let's say they opened a book and the book said Ellen Smith, her book bought in 1692 from Mr. Grover, um, that person might think, I don't know who Ellen Smith is, so we're not going to mention her in the catalog record. But maybe it turns out that Ellen Smith was, an early pioneer of something or another, and she was late. So that information is then hidden. Like nobody knows that Ellen Smith owned this book. And so where a lot of groundbreaking research in book history is happening right now is it's because of people are more interested in these things right now, like what's called provenance. Provenance is it's not just who owned a book, it's, where, like in the art world, like where not only who owned it, but just where has it been over the centuries and how did it get there? Like,
Makes
and
me
with,
think of that movie about the violin that follows the lifespan where it goes from,
I haven't,
location and
I
and
haven't seen it, but Alex's cousin brought that up just 3 weeks ago
is
because I was kind of explaining to her the project that I'm doing. So I
Yeah.
have to check that out because that's exactly what it is. It's the and it's particularly important in the art world because in order to establish authenticity, like especially if a famous or noteworthy painting disappears and then reappears, you're like, where the fuck was it hiding and how the hell do I know it's not a forgery,
Yeah.
right? Um,
I think that's neat that people are so interested in that right now, just because it is like sometimes, when I get something used, I'm very curious about the life of the thing. And it's just a thing. It's not like a
mhm.
400-year-old book or whatever that who knows where it's been.
Yeah.
It's cool. Like how do they, I mean, how do they even track that stuff down though? Like to get more information if it's been hidden.
Well, I can certainly speak to that a lot. So I started off working in the used book world in 2007, and that was kind of what hit the pleasure centers of my brain for me, was opening a book, even if it wasn't like quote unquote valuable or anything, maybe it was just like $45 book or $15 book, was opening it up and seeing like the human interaction with it, whether it was a gift inscription from grandma and like, why'd you get rid of this sentimental book recipient? Or, one of my favorites was a Polaroid of a man in the 70s. He looked like he was in the berth of a ship, just sitting in his bunk in tidy whities. Like somehow somebody inserted this into a book and I was the next person who came across it. And here's this dude in his underpants in the 70s with no context.
Yeah.
So the cool things that, people just write in, or when I was doing research at my local university collection, there's an artist called Eric Gill. He's wasn't a great dude. Um he's famous for the typefaces Gill Sans and Perpetua, and he had a couple other famous ones. You'd recognize his typefaces. Very good
I
artist.
recognize the names. I'm familiar with
Yeah,
them. Yeah.
very good artist, like incestuous interaction with his daughters, like that type of dude. But my local university collection ended up with a biography of him that he owned. So he took a biography that somebody had written about him and was annotating in the margins what he thought. And some of the comments were things like, who says so? And Bosh, just underscored. So so when I worked at this bookshop, that was the kind of thing that kind of like, you know, that really interested me. It's because even like with other old things, I mean, furniture that's apt to survive often for hundreds and hundreds of years if it's well made or if people take the time to preserve it. But rarely do you find things written on furniture, like the maker might sign it or something, but you don't find like that sort of tangible evidence of, oh, that was a real person who lived. I mean, one of the coolest things that um, I came across at the Rare Book Library was back in the day when they made paper. And just as a side note, like if you have a pulp paperback from the 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s, it will be yellow and fragile. Like I was reading, I think it was the like the history of Malcolm X or something. And my book was just a mass market paperback from the mid-century, and it was literally falling apart because it was so poorly made, because that paper is really acidic. But back in Shakespeare's day, there was handmade paper, and people made that out of old clothes and rags. And as a result, it's really durable. And what they would do was they would just basically boil this stuff and beat it down with an implement until it kind of disintegrated. And then there would be this tray, like with a sieve inside, just a flat tray, and you'd pour the fibers in there. And when they would dry, that would be the paper. There was one book when I worked at the Rare Book Library that somebody who was called the Vat Man, the guy who was in charge of making the paper, he pressed his hand down into it, and you could see it just as clear as day. Like this guy who lived 300 50 or 400 years ago. It was just like it had been made yesterday. I just love stuff
Wow.
like that.
That's cool.
So when I was also a bookworm as a kid and was at the library a lot, just stacks and stacks of books. 5 minutes from the library where I was I was a young bookworm cutting my teeth. There is the Illinois State University Library, and that is well, it's self-explanatory what it is. They have what's called a special collections, which usually means rare books, but it can also signify archives, or they're even objects sometimes in special collections, like the special collections down in Texas at the Harry Ransom Center. That's got like the costumes from The Wizard of Oz. That's a special collection.
Hmm.
And they have other 3D artifacts like that that aren't just books. So there's a special collections at ISU. And when I was doing my last class of my master's degree, I did my master's degree mostly online, but I made the exception for this one in-person class because I looked up the professor and found out he's the world's most living eminent bibliographer. And bibliographer is bibliography being like literally just the study of books and how you, not that he's a book historian, he's like more of a it's really meta. It's kind of hard to explain what bibliography is. It's like exploring the history of how people have organized information about books, if that makes sense.
That
So
makes sense.
yeah. So I decided to take that class in person, and I began volunteering at this rare book collection that summer. Um, and when it came time to do a final project for that bibliography class, I said, well, I'm going to pull up a bunch of books from the 15 and 1600s, see what was written in it, and make that my project, marginalia, what people wrote in books. And they have a copy there, and God knows how it ended up there because like most of the prominent rare book collection tend in the United States tend to be on either coast, like where you are. Well, I mean, you're probably nowhere near it, but I mean, in California, you're in California, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's the Huntington Library and Gardens. That's a really prominent collection. Down in Texas, there's the Harry Ransom Center. On the East Coast, you have the Harvard and the Princeton and Yale Rare Book collections. You've got the Folger Shakespeare Library. But I won't say there isn't a whole lot in the Midwest where I am, but there's, they're not usually kind of among like the jewels, that people
Yeah.
think about. So somehow in the Illinois State University rare book collections, there ended up being a copy that was acquired in the 70s of a 1621 book called The Countess of Montgomery's Urania. And it was the first prose work written and published by a woman in English. Not necessarily the first thing that a woman ever wrote, because literature circulated in manuscript before it circulated in print, but it was definitely the first thing printed in English that was a work of prose by a woman. And her uncle was Sir Philip Sidney. He wrote a really famous book called The Urania. That was one of the most widely read books in the late, uh, sorry, I'm thinking about my centuries, the late 16th, early 17th century. And it was kind of modeled on that. But anyway, it's a really scarce book. Somehow it ends up at ISU. And I knew that they had this book. So I decided to look inside this book as part of my project because when you open it up on what's called the paste down, so the inside of the cover, there's an inscription and it said Frances Wolferston, her book bought in London. And I thought, that's kind of unusual that this work by a woman was also owned by a woman. What could that mean? And so I took it back to my mentor and he said, I think you should concentrate your project on this one book. Seriously. So, okay. So I did that and I came to find out that Frances Wolferston was, she may have, had the largest library collected by any English woman in the 17th century. And that's unusual because she kind of lived out in the middle of nowhere. Like I'm pointing to the sheep. Like this is sort of
Yeah.
what it would have looked like where she lived. And when you find women doing extraordinary things in what's called the early modern period, the early modern being kind of like an amorphous term for, like maybe 1450-ish to maybe 1750-ish. Like some people cut it off late or later or earlier. It doesn't matter. It's like a vaguely 300-year span. Um, so usually when you find women doing something extraordinary in the early modern period, they tend to be titled. So their husband is a somebody. He's got, he's a baronet or he's a lord or, he's part of the what's called the peerage, all of these fancy titles that come with estates and they come with connections at court, meaning, you're connected to royalty or you're part of the aristocracy. But Frances Wolferston wasn't that. She definitely had means. She was part of what's called the landed gentry, but her husband, as far as I know, not until 1657 was she titled. I mean, and that's, I don't know if like how much you know about Shakespeare, but that's one of the few things that's actually known about Shakespeare's life is at a certain point, like after he started to get more prominent, he went to London to take out a coat of arms, and that gave him more respectability. That gave him and his family more respectability. Actually, I think his dad did it, but probably like Shakespeare's budding fame enabled his dad to be able to do that. So she
Is it,
wasn't.
I've never heard of that. Like the coat of arms is that something like that you buy into or that you have to do, you have to earn it through like action or
That is a very excellent question. I think it is a marker. Like, I think you have to have a certain amount of wealth in order to apply for it. And then it gives you the right to bear arms. And, in the days when people went out to battle, like, the arms would be on the flag. And okay,
yeah,
that's Ellen Smith's clan over there to bring back Ellen Smith. But
yeah,
yeah, I don't know if you if it was just like I am tied to money and land. Like I'm a book historian, so I
yeah.
kind of vaguely know. I definitely don't know as much as I would like to know. But that's a great question. Um, but anyway, so yeah, so Frances was this lady who lived in the English Midlands. It was, I think, at that time, like probably, well, it's a it's probably a 2-hour drive from London. I don't know what it would have taken to travel there in the day before mechanized vehicles. Um, but she managed to just collect a crazy amount of books. And what's noteworthy about her books is that there are just dozens and dozens of plays. There are verse pamphlets, meaning like, short little 12-page books written entirely in poetry, and they're pithy and, kind of cute and fun. Um, she had a lot of these. So Urania is what's called a chivalric romance. So it's not a romance like Harlequin romance, but it's more like epic in scope, and there are knights and there are ladies and there's a love story. She had novels, um, and that's kind of that is, I won't say it's unusual, it's more atypical to find during that time period because there were a lot of dudes with a lot of opinions at this time period, and their opinion was like, if women read too much of this stuff, they're going to be idle. They're not going to be doing their child rearing and their housework and their godly duties. They're going to become lustful. So, like, we definitely can't have women enjoying themselves sexually. That would
Yeah.
be a disaster. So you do find like a certain number of treatises written by male writers that talk about, like a woman should never cherish Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, which is the thing that he became famous for in his lifetime. It's an erotic narrative poem, like, because she'll put it against her naked breasts and there it will lodge. And so the book that I'm writing right now about Francis Wolferston, that's where it starts. So it starts off in the late 1700s. There's this Irish scholar, Edmund Malone, who's absolutely obsessed with Shakespeare. He gets inheritances from his father and uncle. He quits his job as a lawyer and devotes his life to scholarship. And among that scholarship, he's really, really into Shakespeare. And back in the day, when anybody wanted to publish a book, and Shakespeare did not he did not publish any of his plays. He didn't make any money off of his plays. He made money off the performances, or he made money off of patronage. But back in the early modern period, if you were an author, you didn't make money. Or you didn't make money by printing your books. That's not the way the trade worked. Like, if somebody bought the rights to your books and printed it and sold it, then they could get some profit from it. But royalties were very far in the future. So if you wanted to print a book, you had to go through the guild, because there were guilds in England, and there was something called the Stationers Guild. So you had to basically apply, and you would enter your little book into the Stationers Guild. So that's how we know that there are a lot of books out there that don't survive, for example, because it would be entered in the Stationers Guild on this date. So we knew that it might have existed once upon a time, even if it doesn't exist now, because that's the thing. Like, a lot of books in the early modern period, especially if they were popular, they just got read to death because they were in a society where they were less, it wasn't, there's no there was no fast fashion, or consumption of stuff that you didn't really
Hmm.
need. Everything was reused and recycled. So when people had worn books out to death, they used them as toilet paper, or if they were baking a pie, they would maybe put a page or two in the lining, to, like, prevent the crust from sticking to the pan or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so a lot of these early printed books, especially ones that didn't have bindings but were more in pamphlet form, they just don't survive. So that's exactly what the first work ever published by Shakespeare was. It was this erotic narrative poem called Venus and Adonis. It was printed in what's called quarto format, meaning it was folded twice to make 4 pages. There's I won't go down that rabbit hole, but if you've ever heard of Shakespeare's First Folio, have you heard of Shakespeare's First Folio?
Mm-mm.
Oh, okay. It's one of the most collectible books in the world, even though there are 235 copies at this point, which in rare book terms, it doesn't really mean rare, because, like, if there are 235 of it, it's not like there's two of it, right?
Yeah.
But it was the thing that Shakespeare died in 1616, and this was published in 1623 by some actors who had worked for him. And if it had not been published, we would have lost plays like Macbeth, because Macbeth had never been printed before. Um, but it's important because a folio means you take a piece of paper and you just fold it once. And if you're talking about a period where materials are expensive, especially paper, because again, you got to make that shit by hand.
Hmm.
Um, it means that folios are really only reserved for very important works like the Bible. So by having Shakespeare printed in folio, this, expensive, important format, it's kind of signaling, like, this is an important dude. Although he didn't really, like, the Shakespeare mania that we see today, like, that didn't start taking off until sometime in the 1700s. But anyway, like, I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole. The point is, Edmund Malone really wanted the 1593 first edition of Shakespeare and Adonis, because it was the first time that Shakespeare had ever published a book. He knew that it had been printed because it's in this Stationers Guild. So he knew that it had to be, like, at some point in time, it had to be out there, right? And it's um Shakespeare printed it probably because theaters were closed at the time due to plague, and he couldn't make any money putting plays on. So he turned to a patron who's this 20-year-old dude called Henry Roysley, and he's puts his hand out and basically says, I dedicated this book to you. Like, please give me money so I can buy more. It's, it's the OG Patreon, right?
Right.
Um, I mean, that's exactly what it was. So Shakespeare probably looks at this 20-year-old man and thinks, he'd like a dirty book. So um Venus and Adonis, it's totally at odds with how most people think of Shakespeare now, because most people think of Shakespeare as playwright, right?
Right.
He's not a guy who wrote dirty poems, but that's how people knew him during his lifetime. That was the thing that was most popular. It was Venus and Adonis. It's almost, outside of Shakespeare scholars and, English majors, it's almost completely unknown because you have the epitome of, sexuality and beauty herself, Venus, coming down from the skies and falling in love with this young hunter called Adonis. And the friction is that this guy, he's probably the only guy on earth, like, he does not want anything to do with her. And she tries everything she can think of. And there are innuendos where she's telling him to drink from her fountains and stray lower and like where the bottom grass is. And it's just highly, highly filled with innuendo, which is probably why it was so popular, because it's like she sort of stands in for whoever you think the sexiest person in the world is. She was that to her readers. And here's this kid who's like, I'd rather just hunt, ma'am. Like, leave me alone. And eventually it ends badly. Like, she says, I think you're going to be gored to death by a boar. And guess what? He's gored to death by a boar. But, not before she's kissing him. And like, she even straddles him at one point. She's really, really trying to get him to like her, but he doesn't. So this was, you know, this book collector in the late 1700s, Edmund Malone, the scholar, he really wanted a copy of it, not just because he was a scholar and he wanted to write about it, but he was also a book collector and he knew, like, this is really, really prize. And he
Mhm.
just could not find a copy. He looked for 25 years. Like, he placed an advertisement for it. He's like, I'll give, I don't know, I don't even know I can't even remember what a guinea is, but he's like, I promise you however many guineas if you give me a copy. And finally, in 1805, this bookseller in Manchester reaches out to him and says, like I've got one. And he wanted 25 pounds for it, which at the time, I guess, was a ton of money. And Edmund Malone got peeved about that. He didn't really want to pay it, but he kind of realized, like, I've been looking for this for 25 years. Another copy is never going to come. So finally he gets it. And can you guess the twist?
It belonged to, I don't remember names, but it belonged to
Yeah.
before.
Yep. That's whose name is on the title page.
That's
And
cool.
since that guy died in 1815-ish, maybe before then. I think he died before then. Since his death, no other copy has ever been found. That's it. So
Wow.
she preserved, like, what could be arguably the rarest Shakespeare book that one could ever collect, because again, it's the first time he ever appears in print. It's one of only two times that he writes a dedication. Um, and he actually had probably somewhat of a direct hand in bringing this to print in a way that he didn't with his plays, where people just, brought them into print unauthorized. So anyway, to wrap
Yeah.
up, that's what I've been doing.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Is working on
Like,
this project for the last 10 years. And I mean, really, at the core of it, what it is just like, I'm not in academia anymore. Like, this isn't going to get me a assistant professorship or full professorship. That's the game I'd be playing if I was in academia. It's just going to take a lot of time. And at the end of it, I'll have the satisfaction of, hey, but her story is so accessible and cool that I think it deserves to be told outside of academic circles, right? Because
Yeah.
she's just kind of like she's more ordinary, and we can relate to her. We can relate to her liking a story so much that she has two copies of Venus and Adonis. Like one's a smaller copy, probably so she can tuck it down the front of her front of her shirt against her naked breast,
Yeah.
Like she probably really dug this dirty poem. And that's, it's just kind of fun to think about that. And she left annotations in a lot of her books. So she owned a copy of Shakespeare's Othello and she wrote that it was a sad one. Um, and what makes me think that she was what's called a bibliophile, meaning a book lover instead of just merely like a reader, is the fact that she kept a book that she apparently just did not have the time of day for because when she annotated it, she just wrote, I do not like this. But she kept it. She didn't get
Yeah.
rid of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, so to go back to one of your earlier questions, how do you find more of these books? Well, there, her books stayed at her estate long enough to be sold off in the mid 1800s. So there is a catalog of these books that were sold at the sale. They also include her descendants' books. So, it's not just her books. You kind of have to do some deductive reasoning. Like if anything was printed after she died, obviously she didn't own that. Um, but other times it's just happenstance because that catalog, the book that is 5 minutes from the library where I went to, where I spent so many hours as a kid, that book wasn't in the catalog. That book was sold before the Venus and Adonis, that was sold before 1856. So I think what probably happened, so she wrote her own will, which is, unusual. We don't have I mean, there are a lot of examples of women writing wills, but they are far, far scarcer than men writing their own wills. But she wrote it in her own damn handwriting. And she wrote in her will that she wanted to give all the books to her youngest son conditionally, she said. But if any of his other brothers and sisters want them anytime, like they can have them to read. And when they're done, they should carefully put them in their place. So basically, she was saying, use the books, read the books, put them the hell back when you're done. And I think that probably held sway over her kids, maybe to a certain degree. Her grandkids respected that. But like at a certain point, once you're far enough down the line generationally, like the stuff just doesn't have sentimental value anymore. So I think probably what happened was, you know, her book collection likely stayed mostly intact until her sons and daughters had all died off. And then probably the stuff that was thought to have value was sold off. Like there's what's called an incunable, and it's in I think the Netherlands, maybe. Um, and an incunable is a Latin word that literally means swaddling cloth, and it refers to books that were printed in printing's infancy, hence the swaddling cloth. So an
Uh,
incunable is a book that was printed in 1500 or before, and books started being printed around 1450 by Gutenberg. So anyway, she owned this biography of a female saint that was printed in around 1492 or 1493 by the second printer in England. I won't call him English. I think he was Dutch. His name was Wynken de Word, which is a pretty cool name.
that's a
Um,
pretty cool name.
yeah. And we know based on provenance, like AKA who owned that book after her, we know that it could have left her library like no later than probably like 1730. So like almost probably within 50 years of her death, stuff starts getting sold off. And I think what happened was her descendants sold off what they thought was valuable. And then the stuff that was left over in 1856, like a witness to the auction that was held of her family's library said, oh, this person would have accepted like 30 pounds for the lot, which at the time wasn't a lot of money, but the sale realized like 850 pounds. So
Hmm.
it can, it's a problem to try to guess like what books might have been in her library. Like we know that she probably owned, like an early book on depression called The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton, because in another book about melancholy, which is sort of an early modern synonym for depression, she copied like passages from The Anatomy of Melancholy. So she had access to a copy. It's probably her copy.
Hmm.
Um, but she also, when she wrote her ownership inscription, she was pretty consistent. So it was always Frances Wolferston, her book. And by going to these online public catalogs for universities and typing in variations of her name or typing in variations of her book, I was able to find like additional books from her library. So at the time I started this project, there is a scholar called Paul Morgan. He was like an earlier generation, greatest generation or silent generation. I can't remember which, maybe silent generation. So anyway, he died in the early 2000s at a ripe old age. Um, and nobody had picked up after where he'd left off. So he found around 100 of her books and nobody had picked up where he'd left off. So I just went ahead and started finding more. I found about 100. There are now 235 of her books that are out there, which is the same number as Shakespeare's first folio, which is like part of my pitch. I'm trying to get an agent right now so I can get a book, you
Yeah.
know, and drive myself just just be nerdy, just follow
Yeah.
this to its conclusion. But like honestly, I do it because I enjoy it, and I think her story deserves to be told. So I've probably told you way more than you wanted to know about
I'm
publishing and
totally
printing and
like enthralled.
bookselling.
I've never cared about Shakespeare, but you talked about stuff that was actually interesting. Like I think the sort of the polishing of Shakespeare in
Hmm.
is what has always made it not interesting. Like
Yeah.
but also like there's sort of a pattern there because we have like artists and stuff now that are really well known for doing certain things, but then if you actually dig into their background and other stuff that they enjoy doing, there's a lot of times there's like naughty stuff,
Hmm.
like Mike Judge, Beavis and Butthead artist. He's known for Beavis and Butthead, but like he was part of this like cartoon festival and drew these like really like raunchy things. And there's just there's like a this very human thing about that. And the way that like we try to get rid of that part a
Hmm.
lot, so the fact that you just basically humanize Shakespeare a little bit for me in a way that's never been done before. But yeah.
That reminds me of, have you ever heard the term Bowdlerize?
I don't, can you say it again?
Okay. Bowdlerize, it's like
Mm-mm.
Bowdlerized. It comes from, and I believe his first name was Henry Bowdler. Um, in the 1800s, like when the Victorians were, you know, enjoying Shakespeare, he thought, ugh, there's too much risque material in here. So he basically went through Shakespeare and came out with an edition that didn't have as much naughty bits in it because he didn't feel like it was proper and on the level. So when you say Bowdlerize, it means like you're censoring or you're bastardizing something.
Gotcha.
But there is plenty of that in Shakespeare. There's oral sex jokes in Shakespeare. There are penis jokes in Shakespeare. There are fart jokes in Shakespeare. And the thing is, like, I'm privileged enough to live in a town that has a really good Shakespeare Fest, the Illinois Shakespeare Fest. Like, it's literally a 5-minute drive for me. So I see it. I see Shakespeare on the stage every summer. Um, and when you see them acted out loud, like, yes, especially with the tragedies and the histories, which are more serious, but they usually got some comedic bits in there. When you see it on stage, like you're less caught up in trying to understand what the language means, and the actors are kind of telling you what it means through their body language, and you get the jokes better because the actors are like thrusting their hips or making funny gestures and stuff. And it's a lot funnier and more engaging. And also, I think that, you know, Yeah, Shakespeare does have this reputation as something like he's only taught in colleges, he's boring, like, but if you see it in person, that kind of starts to dissolve, like, especially when you realize he was writing these jokes for, he was writing for everybody. There was something in Shakespeare's time called the groundlings. So the people who would be in the cheap seats, they'd be like swearing and spitting at the stage and just being chaotic during the whole performance. And they were not the aristocracy. They were not well educated. But he was writing for those people too. He wanted them to enjoy themselves, not just the wealthy patrons and
Yeah.
you know. So anyway, that's kind of the rabbit hole that I fell down in grad school and that I'm still trying to claw my way out of. I mean, I I have perfectionist tendencies, and so for the long time I thought, oh, I need to learn more about this, or I need to learn more about that, and I really got to learn about this before I'm prepared to write this book. And then I thought, you know what? No, because I'm never going to get to that point. Everybody's got deficits in their knowledge, and whatever mine are, I can just fill them in along the way.
Yeah.
So.
That's that's something that I've only learned more recently is how to do that. Like I used to just it's like I would always try to mentally prepare beforehand and I think I limited myself and I've just started like just
Mm-hmm.
doing stuff and then figuring it out as I go. I think for me like learning about my ADHD and then like starting to manage it and treat it just like it made it feasible. Like it made me feel like I
Mm-hmm.
could handle the unexpected or the unknown
Mm,
while in the act of doing something rather than trying to be prepared for it or whatever.
yeah.
It's such a different mindset though. Like it's very like freeing, but sometimes I'll like kind of forget that I've learned that and I'll start like stressing myself out. I'm like, no, no, no.
Mm-hmm.
Gotta just do it. But so you're working on a book about her and her books and stuff, and then you said agent, so like agent for getting it published.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So there was probably a time where the author just took a manuscript directly to the publisher. Maybe even like, maybe this was even common like 60 or 70 or less years ago. But nowadays everything is kind of run through agents. So you find a person to represent you. They know about the publishing world. Like I ain't no dick about the publishing world. I mean, I don't know what publishers are looking for. I don't know how to, jazz up a pitch or proposal in a way that will attract them. I don't know anything about contracts or like especially what the state of the publishing industry is now with like not just ebooks, which, back when those came out, like Kindles, it was sort of trying to predict the death of the publishing industry. And, turns out people still like reading physical books. So that was overblown. But it's more like there's so much information competing for people's time and energy. And when you're
Hmm.
working 40 hours a week, like maybe you do just want to get your information from TikTok and no shade there because it's,
Yeah.
you know, having screens has altered our brains in a way that makes it harder to concentrate on books. But anyway, kind of going off on a tangent again. An agent knows how to navigate that world. So most people who want to be published by trade publishers, meaning like non-academic or non-self-published, they will try to find an agent first and an agent who represents their type of genre. So like I am definitely not looking for an agent who primarily publishes like LGBTQ vampire fiction because
Yeah.
there is a surprising amount of agents out there who really want fantasy, sci-fi, LGBTQ, and just like very niche genres of romance, like
Yeah.
paranormal romance.
There's apparently a lot of demand for I yeah. I was just thinking like the topic like there's another podcast that we haven't recorded in a couple of months because she's doing like she started a new job. But when we start again, the focus of it is basically interesting women of from history,
Hmm.
and sometimes they're like evil, so like early serial killer women, and then
Nice.
women who basically bucked the system at a time when it was very difficult for women to do that, and or there's women that did that, but we never heard about it because they did it in a man's name,
Hmm.
and or
Yeah.
but I think that like she when your book's done, like I could totally see us like talking about her on the podcast. I
Oh
feel
yeah, that'd
it
be
totally
fun.
seems like a topic that I think there's a fair amount of people would be interested in. So it'd be cool when your book is out
Hmm.
to.
Right, because like when you think about the history of book collecting, you think of distinguished male collectors and their very regal looking libraries and their leather chairs everywhere and gilded bindings. But like here's somebody who collected a fuck ton of books while, being a mother and a housewife and managing land and like she
Yeah,
probably had a closet where she kept them, which is just a small space of her own. She probably kept a lot of them in a trunk. They weren't on a shelf.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it's fun to think about. And it's fun to think about, she liked it so much, she just collected them from everywhere. Like the biography of the saint that I mentioned, she wrote that it was bought from a soldier, and probably that means a soldier from the English Civil War, which occurred in the 1650s and 1660s when Charles the Second, I cannot believe there is now a Charles the Third. um, when Charles the Second was beheaded and Oliver Cromwell and his dudes took over. But like those books were probably looted because Oliver Cromwell's people looted a bunch of estates. Probably these soldiers were hawking some books, and she's like, I'll take some of those.
yeah.
Or, her sister would give her some books, like Given Me by my sister, Ursula Middlemore. She got a Cervantes novel, the guy who wrote Don Quixote, like she got that from her sister. Her mother-in-law gave her a copy of Chaucer.
Hmm.
Just people in her life seemed to know that she was a book nerd and directed books toward her, which was cool. Like, because again, you don't think of women in the 1600s doing this type of thing, like let alone a woman who wasn't, I mean, she was privileged, but not like hyper super privileged, like
Yeah,
a lady might have been.
yeah, and also like people that read a lot are they just they're more educated because they've put all this information and they have this relationship with like reading and stuff, and so at a time
Hmm.
when women weren't necessarily appreciated for being smart, so
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wonder how much that did she tone it down or just was accepted in her environment for how she was, or
I kind of think the latter, which is not what I think scholarship has kind of tended to think like maybe women would have faced disapproval for this, but at least in her community, I think people dug the fact that she was a book nerd. And when she died, her eldest son commissioned a marble tablet. I've actually seen it in person because I went to her estate. It's still there. It's still entailed on the male line, like in Downton Abbey, where, there was no male successor and they're trying to figure out how they can inherit this estate. It's still actually passed down to the male line, like where she lived. And I got a grant in 2016 to do some research in England and also go there. And the chapel where she worshiped and where she's buried is still standing. And there's a marble tablet that her son commissioned, and he wrote verses for her and her husband, who died 11 like 10-ish years before she did. Um, and her husband is described as like meek, which is usually a term reserved for women. So
mm-hmm.
from the memorial tablet, the scholar that I kind of followed on the heels of, Paul Morgan, the guy I mentioned earlier, he kind of suspected maybe the husband was the more, I guess, the more like retiring person in that marriage, maybe not as prominent, maybe not as vocal. So she might have had the type of marriage where she kind of wore the pants. I mean, at least
Yeah,
that's the sense that I've gotten.
yeah, interesting. It's cool. It's neat you got to see that in person. um
Yeah, there's a picture of me sitting in the chapel and I just look happy as a pig in shit because I'm just thinking, oh God, I'm sitting where she sat. This is so cool.
yeah,
Yeah.
cool. um totally kind of off topic, but just visiting places put me there. I like when I travel, I like to go to libraries and the places I go
Mm.
to just to see
Hmm.
what their libraries are
Hmm.
like. And I was just curious, like what I assume you've been to libraries besides where you live now or whatever. And like, is there like one
Hmm.
you've been to that's just really, really cool?
Folger Shakespeare Library. Because they have the type of reading room that makes you think, ah, this is a rare book reading room. Like I've been to the one at Princeton, I guess the one at Harvard's kind of antique-y looking, but the ones at Princeton, and the British Library, very modern, very nice, definitely built with scholars in mind. But the Folger Shakespeare Library reading room, like carved wood, very fancy looking books, marble busts, oil
Hmm,
paintings. Yeah, that
very
that
fancy.
one.
That's
Hmm.
that
That
sounds
one's
cool.
fun to use.
Yeah, I've never been in one that looks like that. I think the coolest looking one I've been to is the one in Seattle. It's all very modern and like, like interesting architecture with like weird windows and it's lots of
Yeah.
it's
I've driven
very,
past it
very
before, so I kind of know
nice.
what you are talking about.
Like the air feel is really nice. You almost feel like you're outside even though you're inside.
Mm.
It's
Hmm.
cool. But and then I got to go to some libraries at Stanford University when I worked there. And I don't remember what they were for. They were like, we had to go there for something. And one of them was
Hmm.
underground. And that one was like
Ooh.
very important. It was like an underground library. And I was like, can I just stay here for like a week?
That made me think of the rare book library I used to I used to work in, which I think they moved underground, which in Illinois is not great because water table's underground. Anyone who has a basement, that basement floods. But anyway, when I used to work into what was called the vault, like I felt like the richest person on earth because it smelled, God, the smell of the old books. It's so hard to describe, but there are notes of vanilla, and then it always kind of smelled to me like maple syrup, like pancake syrup, and you can kind of smell the dust and old leather. Like not the greatest if you have allergies, but
Yeah.
and unless you work there, you don't get to go back and see these books, and that's the barrier that I and other scholars hit up against when we're trying to research what's called copy specific aspects of books. Um, because if a cataloger hasn't gone and written down the copy specific details of that book, it's effectively hidden. Like I am 100% sure there are probably at least 100 or 200 more of Francis Wolferston's books out there waiting to be found, but I, if they're sitting on a shelf and nobody wrote down her name,
You have no way of knowing.
they're
Yeah.
gonna sit there till somebody stumbles across it. And one of my scholarly colleagues, Vanessa Braganza, is she actually has a book coming out. I think it's probably going to be published next year. It's all about being a book detective and like happening across a copy specific detail of a book and figuring out it belonged to somebody really, really important, or, and it's just sat overlooked for decades because, or hundreds of years in some cases, because somebody just, I won't say somebody like wasn't looking at it the right way, because what scholars and other people value changes, right? Like
Hmm.
book history, or, you know, the study of so-called ordinary readers, like that just wasn't really a thing 30 years ago. Like values change, and you can't go back in time and tell people, well, in 2014 we'll really think this is interesting, because
Yeah.
and that's the other thing, like when you're talking about a library system, the most expensive thing in a library is the personnel, and like libraries just don't have the funding to give to people to go back and do what's called retro cataloging. They can't go back and recon these books because they're busy taking care of new acquisitions, and so there's all this stuff out there in archives and special collections waiting to be discovered. And the other thing that you should know is that it's open to the public. Anybody can go there. I mean, you might have to apply for a reader's card. You might want to say like why you're there, but if you want to look at a copy of these rare books, like at these institutions, like you should be able to do that, especially at your local university. That's the cool thing. Like people think
Yeah.
that it's very forbidding and out of access for them, but like by all means you should, because old books with that handmade rag paper, they smell so good. There's
That's
nothing that smells like an old book.
it's so funny because when you were talking about how the books were made earlier, I was gonna ask you about the smell and then I just like forgot. And so you went
Mm-hmm.
back to it without me even having to
Mm-hmm.
ask because I was thinking about, when you were describing the books that were made in the 70s or whatever, and the smell that they have as they age is not so good. It's not a good smell.
Mm-mm.
So that's why I
No.
started thinking about it. I was like, I wonder what these old books smell like. So
They
yeah.
smell so fucking good. And there is one book from the ISU special collections that I remember handling. This book about horses, also from the 1600s. It had clearly been stored with horses because like you hold that book a couple of inches from you and it smelled like horses, like in the most amazing way. It was still like God knows how long it had been since it had actually been housed with horses, but it still just it stank of horses. So cool.
That is so cool. That's it. The history that's built into the like these little molecules of,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah, and like one of the Frances Wolferston book that's at ISU, it's got marginalia. She wrote some things in it. It's mainly just notes on characters and stuff, like she's trying to keep track of who's who. But there's one passage in particular in the book in which the male love interest enters the closet, and not to be confused with like a closed closet. It's more just like a small private chamber. So he enters the closet of the female love interest and he finds a portrait that she's promised to her sister or something. And it's a portrait of her. And he's like, I want this. And like he's looking over, and remarking upon her beauty. And it's just like this very intimate scene in which they're in an intimate space. It doesn't cross the line because it is the 17th century, but it's sort of like implied that this is a very sexy scene. And
Hmm.
by God, like if there is not a straight pen like you would use for sewing in the gutter of the book. So like when you open a book down the center, like where like
It's
Frances
a
was,
very subtle marker.
yeah, like she
Yeah.
was saying, kind of like this passage. And I think she also signed on the top of it. Like, why would you sign in the middle of the book? Probably
Hmm.
because she was just like, it's just a subtle way to mark something that stood out to her.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm a big fan of the idea that books should be lived in. I know that a lot of people nowadays have this kind of reverence for books, and when they buy a book, they treat it really nicely. They put it on the shelf, they make sure it's clean, and I don't do that. I read in the bath. Like I live in my books because like I worked in a secondhand bookstore and I seldom buy new books because like why am I going to buy a $30 book when I know that in 2 years it'll be $3? Or why am I going to buy a $30 book when I know that there are 99-cent copies out there? Like I'm just a cheap wad like that. I like to spend my money
Yeah.
in different ways and it's not on books. So like I am all about I if I'm like studying something, I will mark it up. If I'm just reading for pleasure, I usually won't, but I'm all about writing in books, reading. Like I think books should be lived in because that's what makes
Yeah.
them fun, especially after you die. You can find these long dead people who just like, kind of left something of themselves in these books, and you sort of connect with them in that way.
That makes sense. I used to have a very large book collection, and when I sold my house, I realized I was gonna be back to moving a lot, and I just
Mm,
didn't. So I donated a lot of the books and then sold some of the other ones. And I kept a few of them that were like ones that I really like, want to be able to look at. But
hmm.
yeah, most of those books were they were used when I got them, and then like,
Hmm.
I mean, like I had a copy of Stephen King's It that was given to me by an adult. It was like a hardcover. So it was already like worn. And I read that book so
Mm-hmm.
many times as a kid
Oh.
that like, the back part of it was just totally like falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was a kid, I wrote in my name in like all these books. So I had like a decent chunk of my collection had my name in it. So,
Mm-hmm.
if those ended up in circulation out there somewhere, there's books with my name before I legally change it. So my dead name, but um it's kind of
Well,
funny.
somebody might be reconstructing that library 300 years from now. You never know.
Like, yeah. But yeah, I do have like digital of a lot of those books, and I do collect the graphic novels, and it was weird
Mm-hmm.
switching to digital because it was such a different experience, and I had to learn how to
Yeah.
use my brain in that way to be
Mm-hmm.
immersed in a book that just didn't have the same, but like with all the nerve issues with my hands, like holding books was also like a thing. So
Yeah.
I make sure I read every day. I'm like, I just hit my 30 book mark for the year. So,
You're like
um,
three times as read as three times as many as I have,
but
for sure.
I'm reading trash this year. Like I'm reading one of those supernatural like romance series.
That's not trash. Like reading is good for your brain.
I know,
It
but the,
makes
the
you
story is trash. Like I literally like I need to read something else because it's making me so mad. The writer is she needs therapy. I like just like I read like the first two series and then I read this one and all the characters are always the same. The way she describes like she only describes women's bodies and only if they're
Mm,
skinny and then like
mm,
the man becomes like increasingly more controlling and she seems to think that this is romantic and like that
mm.
I like the supernatural crime solving part of it and then the relationships part like just I need to switch to I'm gonna go back to sci-fi soon but like
That's my husband's jam. He
yeah
reads physical books, but on his Kindle, he usually just like he plows through so many science fiction books in a year. That's just kind of his comfort reading.
yeah it's I wanted something that's really easy for me to put down because when I get into a book I won't notice that the sun has come up or gone
Uh,
down and I have other
mhm,
things I want to focus on. So that's why
right.
I've been reading something that I can literally just put it down. I don't think about it the rest of the day. And once I go back to reading stuff I really enjoy, people are not going to hear from me and I'm going to be in that space and
Hmm.
but yeah,
Yeah.
sci-fi is kind of my like my happy place, like but I like other genres too, like horror and stuff like that. Romance is probably like the
Hmm.
one that I like the least generally. I don't mind relationships if it's written in the stories well, but I don't like stories that is the plot. Like I just
Hmm.
it's not,
Yeah.
you know.
Like if I want to scratch that itch, I go to fan fiction, man. It's like I don't want to read about two randos falling in love. Like I want it to be somebody that I kind of know or I have a parasocial relationship with. So yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was going to say something about science fiction and horror. Oh, yeah, usually each October I make a point of reading a Stephen King book because like I until 4-ish years ago, I hadn't read him since high school. And some of the stuff you liked when you were a teen, it doesn't age well. It's not actually very good. Like some of the music I've gone back to, it's just completely unlistenable. Like this is just total garbage. But my baby ears, latched onto it for some reason. But not so with Stephen King. He is such a
Mhm.
goddamn good writer, such a
And
fucking
he's
good writer.
just as he's matured, he's just gotten better. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, I know some people are like, oh, this new books and stuff because he started to like see women as people and stopped objectifying them as much. And I
Yeah.
think that's just made the stories all the more interesting. But
Hmm.
I read my first Stephen King book when I was 7. I read Firestarter because
You're
I read
earlier.
all of my
You're
mom's
earlier.
books. Yeah.
Yeah, you're earlier than me. Like I ran out of stuff to read in my room, and I read Cujo when I was 8. My parents were totally unaware, and yeah, it I think I liked it, but it kind of disturbed me and didn't makes sense to me, parts of it, because I don't even think I knew what sex was at that point. But
Yeah.
anyway,
I don't
wow.
think, yeah, I don't like I don't
Firestarter
know
at
if my,
7.
I don't know if my mom knew that I read all, like she had, I read all of her
Hmm.
books, including Delta Venus by the time I was 10. And, I just read all of them and I just took it all in as like, but Stephen King, I loved like, so I started reading like Clive Barker when I was
I
in
used to love
like
Clive
12 or
Barker. I need to pick him
13.
up
Yeah,
again.
I haven't
I've
read
still got
him
my
in a long time, and I'm like, I've been thinking about it lately. Like, I feel like I should go back to
I've still
read his
got my
stuff.
well-worn thrift store copies of Books of Blood.
Yeah.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, there's some good like ooh, books.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was
Um,
when I started getting into graphic novels, it was interesting because like I thought like comics were cool when I was a kid, but like I had like this pile that my uncle left when he went into the military, but it was all like Fantastic Four and stuff. And the stories
hmm.
weren't really like that appealing to me. So I didn't really get into it. But then when I started getting into like being exposed to graphic novels that were not like the superhero stuff, there's actually some really awesome stories out there with like incredible
Hmm.
artists. And so that's kind of like my collection is all just art that I really like with like these really cool stories that are,
Hmm.
not what people who've only been exposed to sort of the pop culture comics, they don't
Hmm.
necessarily expect that. There's so much cool stuff out there. And it's another fun medium for imagination.
Yeah, that's a genre I wish I knew more about, but it's like a bandwidth thing. You hear about something and you think, oh, that'd be cool, and then think, yeah, with a fucking time.
Right? Yeah.
Like I think fewer than 10 books this year because I'm just like I've got so many irons in the fire.
Yeah.
But I got my stockpile for whenever that halcyon day when I have all the time in the world,
Right.
which who knows how many decades from now that'll be.
Yeah. I went a long time without reading much, so it's nice to be incorporating it again. And for a while, like when my health was really bad, I couldn't read. I couldn't it would make me fatigue. So
Yeah.
it's nice that
I
it doesn't do that anymore.
yeah. I have a couple friends with chronic health problems. One's got, just a constellation of mystery immune system problems, and the other gets really, really bad migraines. And they both usually just listen. I say just, but they listen to audiobooks because it's hard for them to engage with physical books just
Yeah.
because of the strain causing headache. And like you said, like the physical act of lifting a book if you're not able-bodied or your body isn't cooperating with you on a particular day.
Right. I wish I could do audiobooks, but I don't hear them.
Oh, right. You were talking about how you have that brain quirk, like
Yeah.
where it's hard for you to picture, it's hard for you to
Yeah, I
picture
don't
things.
yeah, I don't visualize very well almost at all. So when I read
Hmm.
books, the way that I like remember the names of characters and stuff isn't through the description of what they look like. It's the shape of the word or
Oh, wow.
their role. So I'll
Hmm.
remember like, oh, that person is like head of the guard or whatever the junk. And
Hmm.
that's, some so my relationship with characters is a little different sometimes. And then I have auditory processing disorder. So like that like mixed with the ADHD just like makes it really hard for me to like kind of listen and get information that way.
Mm.
If it's interactive where I can reiterate what I've heard or
Hmm.
do hands-on learning at the same time, then I can like, but like, like when you're in school and you're taking like notes and the teacher's like talking and stuff,
Hmm.
there's nothing. There's
Mm.
nothing there for me.
Yeah.
And so yeah, audiobooks are like I can put it on and use it as stimuli to get stuff done, but I won't actually
Hmm.
take any of that information in. So
Hmm.
it's interesting. Like podcasts, I mainly just listen to ones that make me laugh because that sticks better. Like
Uh-huh.
wait, don't tell me is like my favorite one.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, but even TV is like that for me. I put TV on, I just craft and stuff because And I'll be like, I don't know who anybody looks like in this show. Like, I have no idea, but it was about
Hmm.
something. But
Yeah. That's
yes,
usually how I watch things too. Like I won't watch, well, I don't have a TV, but like streaming stuff. I usually won't watch stuff unless I am sitting down with somebody, because that kind of forces me to just sit down and not doing something else. But I always feel like if I'm watching something, I've got to be doing something with my
yeah,
hands too, sewing
same.
or I don't know why.
Yeah, I'm the same way. And I don't, like I don't mind it. I intentionally, especially in the evenings, make sure that I'm doing things, not looking at my phone. Like,
Hmm.
that's sort of like a lot of people are like, they want to like chat or whatever in the evenings. And I'll be like, oh, this is my crafting time. And I put my phone
Hmm.
down. And then they'll be like, oh, you never responded or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I was crafting. I'm not looking at my phone right now. Like I turned off my notifications in 2014 and never looked back. Like I refuse to have that relationship with my phone. So
That's a good quality of life move.
yeah, it's I every time I hear somebody's got their phone on, I'm like, I forgot how noisy they are.
Hmm. Yeah, and they're designed to, get your attention and also release that little burst of endorphins when you see the text message. It's a
Yeah.
vicious circle. I've read a lot about detethering. I am not as adept at detethering as I would like to be. But last night I missed an important text from a friend because I was doing some phone free time in the parlor with Dracula. That's what I'm reading right now for the first
Nice.
time, and it's fun.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Well, I have got to start to wrap this up
Okay.
because I need to eat. I need to let my puppy out. So do you want to do the question?
Yeah, let me do the repping and the up thing and then we'll do the questions. So
Awesome.
thank you everybody for hanging out. I hope you guys, enjoyed the conversation. If you have any questions or input or whatever, just, you can send it and I will send it to Sarah so she can see what you guys had to say. And we are now going to do the QA session, which is a patron exclusive. So, all right, see you guys next week.
Thanks, Lee.
You. Thank you for hanging out and listening. A huge thank you to my patrons. I could not do this without you. Want to support my creative chaos and get access to exclusive content? Check out my Patreon. Have questions and are interested in joining me for a conversation? Email me.